In the mid-1960s, the world was in the midst of the Cold War. Conflict in Vietnam was heating up, and the space race was ongoing. In Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring erupted into violence. But 20 years later, the Cold War had come to a halt. In 1989, revolutions overthrew the communist governments in Eastern Europe. Then 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, we'll look at the end of the Cold War. We'll start by looking at Vietnam, which is a major event in the Cold War, especially from an American perspective. Vietnam originally was a French colony, but after World War II, in the process of decolonization, it became independent, and it was divided into two different regions. You had the north under Ho Chi Minh, who was a nationalist and a communist, and then in the south you had under Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a harsh ruler, but since he was fighting against communists, he was the ally of the Americans. There was promises for a free election and for the country to be reunited after it, but almost immediately there was hostility from the north and the south. Guerrillas were coming down from the south, the Viet Cong, and attacking from the north. They were coming from the north and attacking the south. There was also some internal resistance in the south, hoping to liberate the government and join the north in a communist government. So there was initially some tension. Under President Kennedy, he didn't place any American troops in there, but he sent over American advisors. Under Lyndon B. Johnson, there was a huge escalation in the war. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was after two Americans were attacked, and it gave Johnson support for increased involvement, and he started sending in U.S. combat troops. 1965, the first combat troops arrived. Every year it kind of increased until by 1969 there was almost 500,000 Americans fighting in Vietnam. The Americans were trying to do several things. We wanted limited involvement, but at the same time we wanted to stop the domino effect. That is, if one country became communist, then the rest of the region will also become communist. It was a policy of containment. So the United States had been there for several years by 1968, and then in January, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive, which was a coordinated attack on the South. It was a tactical mistake and lots of casualties, but it showed the public in America that we were not really very close to winning the Vietnam War. Lyndon B. Johnson's popularity declined, and there was a lot of dissentment among the American population over the Vietnam War. Soldiers in Vietnam started fragging. This is where incidents where lower-ranking members of the military would kill their officer, and there was about 730 incidents. There's lots of drug use in the military. There was the My Lai massacre, where American ordered the killing of 200 civilians. There was protests across colleges and universities. There was a Kent State incident where the ROTC building was burnt down. The National Guard was called in, and 4 students were killed. And a lot of people were just tired of fighting the war. So, and then doing the elections, Richard Nixon promised an honorable peace, but he was elected in 1968, and 4 years later, by 1972, we were still fighting 5 more years. So facing the pressure of re-election, he finally agreed to a peace settlement in 1973. But the war restarted soon after. In 1975, there was a full invasion of the South by the North, and the U.S. refuses to intervene this time. By April 1975, the South had fallen, and America kind of abandons the situation. Laos and Cambodia similarly falls to the communist. So when you look at this whole region, it was kind of a disaster for the American policy and a quagmire for our military. As the Korean War was as the Vietnam War was progressing, there's also incidents in Eastern Europe. Prague in 1968 erupted in revolution when there was popular support for more freedoms, and then the Russians, fearing that if Czechoslovakia falls, the rest of their states will fall, so they initiate the Brezhnev Doctrine, named after the Premier Brezhnev of Russia, that any individual states are kind of subject to the good of the whole. That is, if one state falls, all the other ones will do something to uphold it, to prop it up. So they invade Czechoslovakia and crushed the rebellion in Prague. So you have Russian tanks with Russer pack nations, other nations from Eastern Europe, supporting the suppression of this revolution in Prague. You also had the space race, which was part of the Cold War. The Russians surprised everybody and took the lead. In October 1957, they launched Sputnik, which was the first satellite in outer space. They also got Yuri Gagarin, the first human into space. And America was pretty shocked. And so the United States initiates a lot more funding for education, particularly in the sciences. They found NASA, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration. They passed the Defense Education Act, and we began our space program. We surpassed the Americans surpassed the Russians finally in July 1969 when the mission of Apollo 11 successfully put a man on the moon, Neil Armstrong, becoming the first human on the moon. Kind of restores American pride and fulfills a dream that John F. Kennedy had, that they'd put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. After this turmoil, Nixon kind of initiated a problem of détente, which is relaxing some of the tension between the major players. And Nixon goes and visits China. He ends the diplomatic isolation. They start scientific and cultural exchange. They start trade exchanges. And prior to this, we had no communication, no trade, no diplomatic relations with China. So this is a big deal, opening up China to some level of communication. And then in 1972, Nixon also visits Moscow, and they agreed to some level of arms limits on nuclear weapons. And so they were basically what détente is. It's a more orderly, more restrained competition. They also work on some mutually beneficial proposals like trade agreements with trade wheat, for example, or other items that are needed, foodstuff that are needed by these countries. So there is some movement made towards a more relaxed and better, closer relationship between the United States and some of the major communist countries. Then in the 80s, the Soviet Union starts changing. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes a leader in 1985. He's part of a new generation. These are people that came to power after Stalin, so they never experienced the harsh rule of Stalin or any way kind of associated with it. And Russia's facing some serious problems. They're fighting a war in Afghanistan that's going poorly. The Eastern European countries are not really happy with what's going on. Their economy is not keeping up with the Western world. The arms race is a terrible cost for the country, which again their budget cannot support. And Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant, explodes, and it's a great embarrassment and an environmental disaster for the Russians. At this time, you have Reagan is the president of the United States, Margaret Thatcher is prime minister of the UK. They're both very strong individuals. They are, but yet at the same time, they're willing to work with Gorbachev. So Gorbachev starts making some reforms. He makes perestroika, which is a kind of a restructuring, which allows for more capitalism in their economy. And then you have glasnost, which is more open, which translates as openness, which allows for more personal freedoms to be honest. And it also ends the Brezhnev doctrine, this idea that if any country revolts against any communist country revolts in Eastern Europe, they're not going to send in soldiers and tanks. And they also stop the arms race. They agree to limit the amount of weapons that they're producing. So now we have the big year, 1989. This is the year that Eastern Europe breaks away from communism. Now, of course, it's inspired from Russia. Gorbachev's reforms and the lack of the Brezhnev doctrine make a huge boost to the calls for freedom and for democracy and revolution in Eastern Europe. They also have some inspiration from China. There is a famous revolt in Tiananmen Square. It was viewed on television. This scene right here of a man walking out to stop the tanks is an iconic image from this revolution. It failed, but it's still, people watched it and were inspired. The first country to revolt was Poland. There was a Solidarity, was an independent union that was seated in elections, and they won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate, crushing the Communist Party. And it won every seat available to it in the main body as well. So therefore, pretty much with this one election, the communists were just blown out of the water. And Russia doesn't step in to crush this electoral reform and the unseating of the Communist Party in Poland. Hungary, basically the Communist Party, disavows itself from kind of the Russian connection, and they break away. Then people start moving from East Germany through Hungary to Austria or to West Germany, just flooding the West. And eventually, there's all this pressure to bring down the walls. And quite spontaneously, the Berlin Wall dividing East and West comes down, and a year later, there's a reunification of Germany. East and West Germany, which had been divided since World War II, is reunited. Then you also have revolutions in Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania. All those communist countries fall, and only in some rare occasions, like Romania, is there bloodshed. So these are pretty peaceful revolutions. The complete collapse of communist states in Eastern Europe. Soon after, the Soviet Union collapses. The first thing is nationalism, which is amazing. These Baltic states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and then Ukraine and Moldova, and then the Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Georgia and Armenia. They'd been under Soviet rule for decades, but yet they had strong nationalism, and they break away. So that's the first fracturing of the Soviet Union. There is a coup by hardliners to replace Gorbachev, but Boris Yeltsin becomes a leader of resistance against it, and the coup fails. And eventually, the whole Soviet Union collapses. It's dissolved December 26, 1991, and you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, and communism in Eastern Europe and Russia is, for the most part, over. So pretty quickly, in many ways, very shockingly, the Soviet system just falls apart. Um, the United States is left as the only superpower left. The settlement of World War II, which was the troops on the ground in Eastern Europe and the division of Germany, finally resolved, and the Cold War is over. And the question is, what is next? Europe will be more reunited rather than being divided East and West. And how will people react to there only being one superpower, the United States? In that chapter, and those questions are still yet to be answered.